Hi, I'm Claire. I'm 29 years old. For years, my family's Christmas dinners looked perfect. The kind of evenings neighbors envied and relatives praised. But behind the shining tree and the laughter, I was always the one carrying trays. Overlooked. Treated like I barely belonged. Last Christmas, everything I had feared became real. In front of 20 relatives and neighbors, my mother turned to me and said I didn't belong in this family. The room went silent. Every glass froze in midair. Every eye locked on me. What would you do if your own mother erased you in front of everyone you love? I answered her with one sentence. And what followed shattered the perfect image of our family forever. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll understand why that night was the Christmas none of us would ever forget. That night didn't explode all at once. It started the way it always did. With the polished glow of tradition and the feeling that everyone already knew their part in a script my mother had written long before I stepped through the door. Every December in Naperville, my family's house glowed like a holiday card. For 20 years, my mother had turned Christmas dinner into a spectacle that neighbors whispered about and relatives circled on their calendars. This year was no different. I was 29. But walking up the icy driveway that evening felt like stepping back into a role I had never chosen. The Donovan house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. Its 2 stories wrapped in strings of white lights. Every bush covered with glowing nets. The wreath on the door larger than anything sold in regular stores. Inside, I could already hear the hum of voices, the sharp crack of laughter, and the piano in the living room playing a loop of carols from a speaker my father had set up. My mother, Margaret, was at the center of it all. She was 53 now, but carried herself with the polish of a woman forever on display. She had been a teacher years ago, but her true career was hosting. In her world, table settings mattered more than words, and every ornament had to be symmetrical. Guests adored her because she never seemed flustered, always remembered their names, and made every dinner look like it belonged in a glossy magazine. My father, Edward, was 55, and though he was a successful insurance broker, he faded into the background at these gatherings. He liked to play the steady hand, moving chairs, carrying boxes, nodding when my mother gave instructions. I often wondered if he ever wanted to be the star, but if he did, he never let it show. I stepped inside, clutching a small gift bag. The house was warm, heavy with the smell of roasted turkey, cinnamon candles, and pine from the massive tree in the corner of the living room. 20 guests had already filled the house, coats piled in the hall closet, glasses of wine and eggnog balanced in their hands. Some were relatives, others, my mother's book club friends or neighbors who had long become part of the tradition. I had worn a deep green velvet dress that I thought looked festive without being flashy. As I moved into the foyer, Margaret caught sight of me. Her smile, wide and radiant for the guests, she was greeting, faltered when her eyes landed on me. She swept closer, her pearls catching the light. "Claire," she said, lowering her voice, but with enough sharpness to slice through the background chatter. "That dress feels a bit too plain for Christmas dinner. Don't you think?" Heat rose in my chest. It was not the first time she had made a remark like that. I forced a small smile and murmured that I thought it was fine. She patted my arm as if sealing the critique, then turned back to beam at Mrs. Henderson from the school board. Her tone instantly warm again. I stood there for a moment, watching the shift. To the guests, she was charm and hospitality. To me, she was inspection and disapproval. It was a dance I had been doing my whole life. The dining room sparkled with her handiwork. The long mahogany table was draped in a red and gold runner. Crystal goblets placed at every seat. Fresh poinsettias arranged in silver vases. The turkey rested on a carving board, glistening, surrounded by bowls of mashed potatoes, stuffing, and glazed carrots. Even the butter had been molded into Christmas tree shapes. I slipped into the kitchen to help refill trays of appetizers. My familiar role, as I carried out a platter of brie bites, I caught sight of my cousins clustered near the fireplace. laughing and showing off pictures of children on their phones. Daniel, my older brother, was holding court in the corner, recounting a story about his promotion path at Ernst & Young. Our relatives listened with pride shining in their eyes. Sophie, my younger sister, stood nearby, her engagement ring catching the light. Ryan's arm looped around her shoulder. My mother hovered close, nodding and glowing with satisfaction. "Il fait invisible." Mrs. Henderson drifted toward me, complimenting how the appetizers looked. Before I could respond, Margaret swept in with that effortless grace of hers. "Thank you," she said to Mrs. Henderson. "We worked hard on the details this year." She did not look at me, did not mention that the arrangement had been my work. The evening moved forward with the clink of glasses and layers of chatter. I walked between the dining room and the kitchen, replenishing platters, catching fragments of conversations. Every time I tried to linger, someone called my name from the kitchen or asked me to fetch something. I caught my father's eye once, hoping he might notice, but he looked down and adjusted his tie instead. Later, as I set down another tray, I overheard Margaret talking to a neighbor. "Daniel is on track for partner," she said proudly. "And Sophie is planning such a beautiful spring wedding." Then, her voice shifted ever so slightly, and when asked about me she said, "Claire is still figuring things out." A polite laugh followed. The words settled on me heavier than the trays I carried. I was not figuring things out. I had clients, deadlines, invoices. But in her script, I was unfinished, unstable. A daughter who had not turned out the way she wanted. I swallowed hard and stepped back into the kitchen. The noise of the party muffled by the swinging door. I set the tray down and steadied myself on the counter, willing the sting in my eyes to fade before I walked out again. Through the doorway, I could see her in the glow of the Christmas lights, laughing, her hand brushing Daniel's arm, her smile wide as she introduced Sophie and Ryan to another guest. Then her eyes flicked toward me for a brief moment. The smile slipped just enough to reveal the edge beneath it. And I knew the critique about my dress had only been the beginning of the night. I straightened, lifted another platter, and walked back out into the crowd. Daniel's voice carried across the living room the way it always did when he had an audience. He was standing near the fireplace, one hand in his pocket, the other gesturing, as he explained something about a big client at Ernst & Young. Our uncles leaned in, nodding with admiration, while my mother stood proudly at his side. She laughed at the right moments, her hand brushing his arm as if she were his personal cheerleader. Laura, his wife, stood nearby with Emily tugging at her skirt and Jacob bouncing in her arms. At 30, Laura had the gentle look of a woman who knew how to make children feel safe. Her soft brown hair framed a kind face, and she kept bending down to whisper to Emily, keeping her occupied with a small doll. Everyone doted on the kids. Aunt Helen crouched to pinch Jacob's cheek, and Uncle George lifted Emily into the air as if she were his own granddaughter. Cameras flashed. My mother clapped her hands together and said how blessed she was to have such a perfect little family under her roof. I watched from the edge of the room, holding the platter of hors d'oeuvres I had just brought out. My arms ached, but I waited for someone to notice me. No one did. The spotlight was on Daniel and his perfect unit. Sophie swept in a moment later, wearing a cream dress that hugged her waist just enough to show off the diamond Ryan had placed on her finger. She was 26, glowing with the sort of confidence I had never been allowed to own. Ryan, 27, stood at her side in a crisp navy blazer, shaking hands with relatives and nodding politely to neighbors. My mother wrapped her arm around Sophie and with a voice that was almost musical, told the room how excited she was for the spring wedding. She pulled out her phone to show photos of floral arrangements and the venue they had already chosen. Ryan smiled modestly as people congratulated him. He said something about working long hours at City Hall and how Sophie had been patient with his schedule. The crowd loved it. They loved all of it. I heard one neighbor whisper how Margaret must be so proud to have raised such accomplished children. I shifted the tray in my hands. Someone finally reached over to grab a bite without even looking at me, murmuring, "Thanks," before turning back to Daniel. The evening rolled on in a rhythm that felt rehearsed. Margaret made rounds, boasting about Daniel's fast climb up the corporate ladder, reminding everyone that partner was only a matter of time. She talked about Laura's devotion to teaching second grade and how beloved she was by her students. Then she turned to Sophie and described Ryan as the kind of man any mother would hope for in a son-in-law. Dependable, community-minded, with a bright future in local government. Every description was polished, every word dripping with pride. And when the conversation shifted, when someone finally asked about me, her smile thinned. "Claire is still exploring her options," she said, and quickly steered the subject back to Daniel's promotion. I bit the inside of my cheek and kept my eyes on the tree in the corner, the lights blurring slightly. Later, when the appetizers ran low, I slipped into the kitchen and grabbed another tray. As I re-entered the dining room, I caught the tail end of a conversation between one of my cousins and Mrs. Henderson. "The invitations this year were beautiful," Mrs. Henderson said, running her fingers over the cardstock she had saved from the envelope. "So elegant," she added. "I would love to know who designed them." Before I could open my mouth, Margaret's laugh rang out. "Thank you," she said smoothly. "I always pay close attention to the details." The words hung in the air like a slap. My chest tightened as I stood there, balancing the tray, listening to the guests nod with approval. She had taken my work, the hours I had poured into choosing fonts, designing the border, and sketching the tiny holly branches in the corners, and presented it as if it were hers. I wanted to say something, anything, but my tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. I set the tray down too firmly on the table, and a couple of glasses rattled. Daniel glanced up, frowning, then went back to his conversation. The guests moved on quickly, oblivious. But inside I was burning. I walked back into the kitchen and gripped the counter with both hands, trying to steady myself. Through the doorway, I could still hear Margaret's laugh as she showed off Sophie's engagement photos. The sound was bright and clear, like bells, and it sliced through me. I forced myself to breathe, to swallow down the bitterness, and carried another tray out into the crowd. The smile on my face tight and unconvincing. The night stretched ahead, and I knew there would be many more moments just like this. My hands moved on instinct as I refilled glasses and balanced trays. But my mind drifted back to all the years I had played this role. Every Christmas since I could remember, I had been the one in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, handling the work no one else wanted. My brother and sister were ushered into the living room to chat with the guests, to be admired and celebrated, while I was told to stir gravy, check the rolls, or wash another stack of dishes. I remembered being 25, standing at the sink with water up to my elbows while laughter carried from the other room. Sophie had been telling her college stories. Daniel was showing off photos of his new house, and my mother had been right in the middle of it, her eyes glowing with pride. I had stood there, trying to quiet the ache that came from realizing no one even noticed. I was missing from the circle. Since 2018, the sting had grown sharper. That was the year my mother started telling me it was only fair that I contribute to the cost of Christmas dinner. "You are single, Claire," she had said firmly. "You do not have children to feed. No mortgage. No excuses. $3,000 will not break you." She had said it like it was nothing. Like I should be grateful for the privilege of helping her keep her reputation as the hostess everyone envied. I had wired the money each December, biting back the resentment. But Margaret never once mentioned my contribution in front of the family. She would tell the guests that Daniel had been generous, that Sophie had offered to help with flowers, that Ryan had suggested the wine. My name was absent from every story. As I moved through the dining room tonight, holding a platter of stuffed mushrooms, I caught sight of Daniel raising his glass while relatives leaned in to hear him talk about bonuses and company perks. Sophie stood beside Ryan, showing off pictures of their chosen wedding venue. Margaret's laughter wove through every conversation like ribbon, tying the evening together in a way that excluded me completely. I set the platter down on the buffet table and adjusted the napkins, making sure they fanned out neatly. My mother's voice floated across the room, cheerful and bright, as she introduced Daniel to a neighbor who had just arrived. Then, without missing a beat, she steered the conversation towards Sophie's upcoming wedding, pulling out her phone to show photos of a dress fitting. When Mrs. Henderson asked about me, Margaret's tone shifted. Her smile stayed, but her voice thinned. "Claire is still finding her way," she said lightly. "Still figuring out which direction she wants to go." She laughed as if it were an amusing quirk. The words landed heavy in my chest. Still finding my way. Still figuring it out. I wanted to scream that I had clients who paid me on time, that I worked long hours to meet deadlines, that I had carved out a career on my own, without anyone's help. But to her, I was unfinished. A project that had not measured up. I lifted the tray again, my fingers tightening on the edges, and walked back toward the kitchen. My aunt smiled at me as I passed, but she did not stop me. No one did. Inside the kitchen, the air was thick with steam from the gravy and the heat of the oven. I set the tray down, leaned against the counter, and tried to breathe through the knot forming in my throat. From the dining room, I could still hear the hum of voices, the clinking of glasses, and my mother's laughter punctuating every exchange. The door swung open, and Laura stepped in, balancing Jacob on her hip. She smiled kindly at me and said she needed a spoon for Emily's macaroni. I handed it to her without a word. She thanked me softly and slipped back out, leaving me alone with the echo of my mother's words. I stared at the counter, remembering each year I had written the check for $3,000, remembering the way Margaret accepted it like it was expected, like it was nothing, remembering how she had never once acknowledged it in front of others. The bitterness settled deeper, heavier than the weight of the trays I carried. The kitchen door opened again, this time with Margaret sweeping in. She glanced at the counters, at the plates stacked high, then at me. She offered no smile. Instead, she adjusted a vase of holly on the counter and said briskly that the guests would need more wine soon. Her eyes flicked to my dress again, then back to the flowers, as if I were no more important than the arrangement she was perfecting. I nodded without speaking, picked up the bottle, and followed her out. As I poured glasses and set them down, I heard her voice rise once more, full of pride, as she told the table about Daniel's bright future and Sophie's engagement. Then, with that same light laugh, she repeated it again for another group. "Claire is still finding her way." The words pressed against my ribs until I felt I could hardly breathe. I kept moving, kept smiling, kept filling glasses. My silence was the only way to survive the night, and yet, somewhere deep down, I knew I could not keep carrying it forever. The smell of roasted turkey and pine needles clung to the air as I walked back into the living room. But the heaviness inside me came from much further back than tonight. All the laughter and clinking glasses blurred together, and suddenly I was 16 again, standing under the harsh fluorescent lights of the high school art room with a blue ribbon in my hand. My design had just taken first place in the regional competition, a win my teacher said could lead to scholarships. She told me to call my mom so she could be there for the ceremony. I dialed 3 times, waiting, hoping, but she never answered. I remember scanning the crowd of parents as my name was called, holding on to the hope that maybe she would slip in at the last second. But her seat was empty. Later that night, when I came home clutching the ribbon, Margaret was bent over the dining room table, arranging place cards for Daniel's debate team banquet. She glanced at the ribbon, smiled absently, and said, "That was nice," before reminding me that Daniel's team was counting on her to get everything perfect. The pride that should have filled me that day collapsed into a hollow ache. It was the first time I realized I was never going to win her approval in the same way my brother or sister could. From then on, I stopped bringing my ribbons and certificates to her. I tucked them into drawers instead. Back in the present, I balanced a tray of stuffed mushrooms and made my way across the room. The fire in the hearth crackled, throwing shadows that made the ornaments on the tree sparkle. Relatives leaned in close to Daniel as he explained something about a new client, his voice carrying over the chatter. Sophie and Ryan stood nearby, her hand lightly resting on his chest as she told Aunt Helen about the wedding venue they had chosen. I tried to stay invisible, just another server in my own family's home. But Aunt Helen caught sight of me and waved me over. She was in her mid-50s now, her silver hair pulled back neatly, and her face softened as soon as she looked at me. She pulled me into a hug before I could protest, holding me with a kind of tenderness I had not felt from anyone else that night. "Claire," she whispered, her voice low and steady, "you always do more than they realize." The words nearly undid me. My throat tightened and I blinked fast, fighting off the tears. "Thank you, Aunt Helen," I managed, though my voice cracked. She squeezed my hand before letting me go, her eyes saying the things no one else in the room ever seemed to. For a moment I allowed myself to breathe, to believe that someone saw me, but the moment shattered almost immediately. Sophie stepped closer, her cheeks flushed from wine and the warmth of being adored. She glanced at Aunt Helen, then at me, and with a laugh that was too loud, she said, "Can you believe Claire is still single at 29? Not even a date tonight." Ryan shifted awkwardly beside her, clearing his throat, but the words were already out. A few guests nearby turned their heads, some offering polite smiles, others trading quick looks. I felt my stomach knot as their eyes landed on me. I opened my mouth, but before I could form a response, Margaret's voice rang out from across the room. She had impeccable timing, as if she had been waiting to pounce, with her laugh like tinkling bells. She declared, "Maybe next Christmas she will finally have someone to bring home." The room rippled with laughter, light, harmless on the surface, but sharp as shards of glass inside me. My mother's eyes sparkled as if she had just delivered the punchline of a joke, her hand resting proudly on Sophie's shoulder. Sophie smiled too, though there was a flicker of guilt in her glance toward me. The tray in my hands felt suddenly too heavy. My grip tightened, my knuckles white as I held it close against my chest. Every eye seemed to be on me, some filled with pity, some with amusement, none with understanding. The flush crept up my neck, burning my ears. Margaret moved seamlessly into the next topic, talking about floral arrangements for Sophie's wedding, her voice smooth and elegant. The group leaned in again, laughing and nodding, as if nothing cruel had just been said. I set the tray down on the nearest side table, a little too firmly, the glasses rattling. Daniel glanced over, his brow furrowing for a second. But then he turned back to his conversation, choosing the easier silence. I wanted to disappear. Instead, I walked toward the kitchen, each step heavier than the last. The warmth of the living room faded as I pushed open the swinging door. Inside, the air was hot and sticky with steam from the ovens. I braced myself against the counter, both palms flat, trying to will my heart to slow. I could still hear their laughter through the door. It wasn't just about me being single. It was about the unspoken judgment that I was incomplete, unfinished. Not enough. I had felt that same sting 1,000 times before. At Christmas dinners past. At Thanksgiving tables. At birthdays, where the spotlight had always skipped over me. My mind replayed other humiliations. The year Daniel bought a new house, and Margaret made me stand beside him in every photo so she could joke about how one child had accomplished so much while the other was still wandering. The night Sophie brought Ryan home for the first time, and Margaret toasted to the joy of gaining a new son, while I sat quietly in the corner, invisible. The door creaked open, and Laura slipped in with Jacob on her hip. She gave me a soft smile and asked if I had seen Emily's doll, then quickly apologized for disturbing me. I handed her the doll from the counter, and she thanked me before disappearing again. Her kindness was real, but it only deepened the ache. Even Laura, who had married into the family, seemed to belong more than I ever did. Alone again, I leaned back against the counter. The laughter from the other room, rising and falling like waves, crashing against a shore I could never reach. I closed my eyes and swallowed hard. Tonight was only reinforcing what I had always known. I would never be their pride. I would always be the convenient target, The one to fetch, to fund, to fix, and to absorb the jokes. Through the doorway, I heard Margaret's laugh again, clear and musical. As she described Sophie's dress fitting in detail, the sound carried like a bell, smooth and effortless, covering everything in the room. I straightened, forcing my breathing steady, and began arranging the next tray. The night wasn't even halfway through. A month earlier, I had been sitting in a small exam room at a clinic in downtown Chicago, tapping my foot against the tile floor while waiting for routine blood work results. The doctor flipped through the chart casually, then paused. He looked at me, then back at the page, his brow furrowed. He asked if I was sure my parents were my biological family because my blood type did not line up. I laughed at first, thinking maybe he had mixed up the charts, but when he double-checked, the results were the same. My blood type was AB, and both my parents' medical histories showed that was impossible. I left the clinic with my coat pulled tight, the cold wind biting my face as I hurried back to my car. I told myself there had to be a simple explanation, maybe an error in old records, or a distant relative's contribution. But the seed of doubt had been planted. For weeks I tried to ignore it, but the thought gnawed at me. At night in my apartment, I pulled out old photo albums. There were plenty of pictures, but I noticed things I had never questioned before. My eyes were a different shade than Daniel's and Sophie's. My hair was lighter, my skin tone slightly different. Family members always said I must have taken after some great aunt, but now that explanation felt thin. I finally confided in my friend Jessica, who worked in public relations. We were sitting in a coffee shop on Michigan Avenue, the steam rising from our cups. She listened quietly as I laid it all out. When I finished, she leaned forward and said, "Claire, you need to know the truth. Hire someone who can find it." That was how I ended up in a modest office above a strip of shops in Oak Brook, shaking hands with a private investigator named Karen Lee. She was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed, calm, the kind of woman who exuded quiet confidence. I explained my suspicions, sliding across a folder with copies of my medical records. She asked careful questions, took notes, and finally said she would dig into old court archives and county records. The following weeks crawled by. I busied myself with client projects, staying late at my desk, sketching until my fingers cramped. But every time my phone buzzed, I jumped. When Karen finally called, I was walking down State Street, Christmas lights strung between lampposts, shoppers hurrying with bags. Her voice was steady as she told me she had found something. We met in her office the next day. She slid a manila envelope across the desk. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were copies of legal documents from 1993, sealed adoption papers from Cook County. My name was listed differently, a name I had never seen before. My birth certificate had been replaced with the one I had grown up with. But here was the original. My mother's name was not Margaret. My father's name was not Edward. The air seemed to thin around me. Karen watched me carefully and asked if I was all right. I nodded, though the ground felt unsteady beneath me. She explained that the adoption had been finalized quietly, with no public record beyond the sealed files. She said she could trace my birth mother if I wanted, but I barely heard her. All I could do was stare at the unfamiliar names. That night, I sat at my kitchen table in Chicago, the envelope spread open in front of me. Snow fell outside, the streetlights blurring through the glass. I traced the letters with my finger again and again, whispering the name that had once been mine. A life I had never known had suddenly come rushing into view. I thought about all the times Margaret had dismissed me, all the times she had made me feel like an outsider. Now I understood why. I was an outsider, not by choice, but by truth. The days leading up to Christmas became a blur. I tucked the envelope into the bottom drawer of my desk, locked it, then pulled it out again at night, rereading every word. I wondered if I should confront them. Should I walk into the living room on Christmas and demand answers, or should I keep the secret, carry it silently the way they clearly intended? The weight of it pressed on me in every interaction. When Margaret called to remind me to arrive early to help with dinner, her tone sharp as always, I gripped the phone tighter, tempted to say I knew, but I stayed quiet. When Daniel bragged in our family group text about a client win, I wanted to type something reckless, but instead I typed, "Congratulations." By the time Christmas Eve arrived, the envelope was in my bag. The corners already soft from my constant handling. I told myself I would only bring it for my own comfort, that I would not actually reveal it. But as I stepped into the crowded house and heard Margaret's laugh slicing through the air, the temptation grew stronger. Hours later, I stood in the kitchen refilling trays, while the guests mingled, the envelope, heavy in my purse, hanging from the hook on the wall. I reached for it once, my fingers brushing the edge, then pulled away. My hands shook, but my gauze hardened. The noise of the party swelled on the other side of the door. Daniel's booming laugh and Sophie's excited chatter. My mother's voice floated above it all, polished and proud, her kingdom intact. I wrapped my fingers around the envelope at last, holding it close against my chest. My hands trembled, but my eyes narrowed with resolve. Whatever happened tonight, I could not keep pretending forever. I slipped the envelope back into my purse and steadied myself before walking into the dining room. The long table gleamed under the chandelier, crystal glasses filled, candles flickering against polished silver. My mother stood at one end, orchestrating seating like a conductor, her voice bright and commanding. Guests were settling into their places, pulling out chairs, smoothing napkins, and greeting one another with warm smiles. I found a seat halfway down the table beside Aunt Helen, grateful for her quiet presence. Across from me sat Mrs. Henderson, a longtime friend of my mother's from the school board. She was 61, sharp-eyed, with the kind of practiced politeness that came from years of attending gatherings like this. As the dishes were passed around, she turned her attention to me. "Claire," she said pleasantly, "what are you doing these days?" I opened my mouth, relief flooding me at the chance to finally speak for myself. But before I could answer, Margaret's voice cut through. Smooth and practiced, she is still exploring her options, still figuring things out. A ripple of polite chuckles moved down the table. I felt my jaw tighten. "Mrs. Henderson nodded politely and turned back to her plate, clearly taking my mother's answer as final. I picked at the turkey on my plate, pushing it into neat lines with my fork. The words hung heavy in the air. Still figuring things out. I was nearly 30, paying my bills, signing contracts, building a reputation in Chicago. But to my mother, I was a child who had not found her path. Then the man seated 2 chairs away leaned in. He was a neighbor my parents had known for years, a partner at a local law firm. "I think I saw something about you in the Tribune," he said. "Wasn't there a piece about a new startup app out of Chicago? They mentioned the design team. Your name was there, wasn't it?" The fork stilled in my hand. Heat rushed to my face. But this time, it was not embarrassment. It was pride. "Yes," I said softly. "I worked with them on their branding and product visuals." Helen smiled warmly beside me. "I knew it," she said, her voice filled with pride. "That was beautiful work." "Claire." Several heads turned. Another guest asked me about the project, leaning forward with genuine interest. For the first time all night, "I felt mycket expand." Words came easily as I explained how I had worked with the founders, how the app had recently closed a funding round, how the press had highlighted the design for its simplicity and impact. There was a moment of silence, the kind that comes when people are impressed. I caught sight of Laura across the table, smiling at me, and even Ryan nodded as if surprised. But then Margaret's laugh rang out, crisp and clear. She placed her hand on Daniel's arm and said brightly, "Speaking of careers, Daniel just got nominated for the management committee at Ernst & Young. Can you believe it, partner? Track at 31. The focus shifted instantly. Heads turning, voices rising with congratulations. Glasses were lifted, and Daniel grinned modestly. as though he had not been waiting for the moment. The warmth that had been gathering around me was snuffed out in an instant. I pressed my lips together and lowered my gaze to my plate. The conversation surged forward. Questions about Daniel's next steps, about Sophie's wedding plans, about everything that kept me on the edges. My short moment of recognition had been buried beneath my mother's carefully curated script. Helen leaned closer, her voice low. "Do not let her take this from you," she murmured. "You deserve that credit." He swallowed hard, nodding, though the sting was sharp. As the dinner continued, I moved food around my plate more than I ate. Margaret kept guiding the conversations, pulling attention back to Daniel's achievements and Sophie's future. The guests followed her lead, smiling, praising, reinforcing the story she wanted told. I glanced down the table at my purse resting against the chair. Inside, the envelope pulsed in my mind like a heartbeat. The truth was right there, waiting. And my mother had no idea how fragile her perfect image was. The sound of laughter rose again, echoing against the walls trimmed with garlands. I lifted my glass of water, forcing a sip to steady myself, and set it down carefully. For now I stayed quiet, but my hands curled tightly in my lap as the weight of the secret grew heavier. The night was far from over, and I could feel the shift coming closer. Cousin Rachel's laughter rang out above the murmur of voices. Drawing attention down the table, she leaned in toward Aunt Helen, her manicured hand lifting a wine glass as she spoke about the luxurious new winter coat she had just unwrapped that afternoon. Her husband nodded along, adding how the kids had squealed at the sight of the bright red bows and glossy packaging around their feet. Her children showed off their toys, plastic cars scraping against the hardwood, while the adults smiled fondly. At the far end of the table, Mark joined the story with his own update, his cheeks flushed with pride as he told everyone about the house he and his wife had closed on the week before. He described the way the kitchen caught the morning light, the smell of fresh paint still lingering in the halls, and how he could not wait to bring everyone over once they finished unpacking. Margaret's eyes gleamed, her hands clasped together as she called it. Another shining example of the Donovan family's bright future. I clapped politely with the rest of them, though my smile felt thin. Their joy was genuine, but my mother's voice praising them so loudly had a way of scraping against old wounds. The moment Mark mentioned the down payment, a memory snapped open inside me like a drawer, yanked too quickly. It was December of 2020. The year the world felt fragile and uncertain. Yet my mother had insisted Christmas dinner must remain untouched by hardship. She had called me late one night. I can still hear the tone in her voice, a mix of urgency and entitlement. "Claire," she said, "we need some help this year. You know how important it is for the family to have a proper Christmas. Daniel has his career. Sophie has her studies. And you, well, you can afford to contribute." She named the number casually, as if $5,000 were a simple favor, not months of careful budgeting on my part. I hesitated, pressing the phone tighter to my ear, but she cut me off before I could answer. "You do not have children, Claire," she reminded me firmly. "No mortgage. No major expenses. It is only fair." I wired the money the next morning, the guilt pressing harder than the expense itself. I told myself it was for the good of the family, that one day it might matter to her that I had stepped up. That hope shattered a week later when I walked into the living room with trays of appetizers and heard her voice sail above the crowd. "Daniel has been so generous this year," she announced, covering the catering costs so we could all celebrate together. The room erupted in applause, glasses raised high, and Daniel smiled, modest but visibly pleased. I froze at the edge of the room, the tray trembling in my hands, while every clap hammered home the fact that my sacrifice had been erased. Now, 2 years later, the memory returned with bitter clarity. My eyes drifted across the table, and there it was, glinting in the candlelight. A gold bracelet rested on Margaret's wrist, its polished links catching every flicker of flame. I knew that bracelet. I had seen it in the window of a jewelry shop downtown when I was out buying supplies that same winter. I remembered pausing in front of the glass, admiring the delicate design, then walking away because the price tag made my stomach sink. She was wearing it now, raising her hand gracefully as she gestured to Rachel's children, the bracelet sliding against her skin. The money I had given her, the money she said was for Christmas, was gleaming openly on her wrist. My stomach tightened. The taste of roasted turkey suddenly sour. I forced myself to take a sip of water, but it did nothing to wash away the bitterness. Rachel's story spilled on, about the family ski trip planned for February, about how grateful she was for her parents' generosity. Mark added another detail about the new home, everyone nodding and congratulating him as if the entire table shared in his success. My mother laughed, her pearls catching the light, and with every movement that bracelet sparkled, mocking me with its quiet truth. I pressed my fork into my plate, cutting too hard into the mashed potatoes. The scrape of metal against porcelain made Laura glance up from across the table. She gave me a small, sympathetic smile, but she said nothing. Daniel continued his story about client bonuses as if nothing had happened. Aunt Helen's eyes followed mine and landed on Margaret's wrist. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Under the table, her hand brushed mine. A small squeeze. A silent acknowledgement of what neither of us could say aloud. The sound of laughter grew louder, swirling around me. But he felt strangely detached, as if I were watching the scene through glass. I remembered that wire transfer receipt, the ache in my stomach as I clicked send. I remembered the applause for Daniel, the weight of silence when no one even thought to ask if I had helped. And now I was staring at the proof that my sacrifice had been transformed into jewelry, my mother flaunted without shame. The bracelet caught the light again as she raised her glass, and my chest constricted. It was more than metal and links. It was every dismissal, every stolen credit, every time she had rewritten the story to make me invisible. I lowered my gaze to my plate, pushing food around, my appetite gone. Voices rose and fell. Laughter spilled. But the room felt colder, the walls pressing in tighter. My purse rested against the chair at my side, the envelope inside like a heartbeat, steady and unrelenting. For a moment, I let my fingers brush the edge of the purse, grounding myself with the knowledge that the truth was mine to reveal. The bracelet glittered again in the corner of my vision. I forced a breath, steady but sharp, and tightened my grip on the fork until my knuckles went white. The conversation surged forward around me, but my silence spoke louder in my own head. Every memory of erased contributions lined up neatly, like beads on a string, each one tugging harder until the chain felt ready to snap. I lifted my glass, forcing a sip, and set it back down carefully. The party carried on, but I sat in the middle of it all, simmering quietly, my eyes fixed on the bracelet that told a story, only I seemed to understand. The sound of forks against china faded as Edward slowly rose from his chair at the head of the table. He held a glass of red wine in one hand, his posture straight but not stiff, the way he always looked when he wanted to appear dignified without stealing Margaret's spotlight. His voice carried over the conversations, low and even, asking everyone to pause for the Christmas prayer. The room shifted into silence, hands folded, heads bowed. The only sounds were the soft creak of chairs and the faint crackle from the fireplace, the scent of roasted turkey, pine garlands, and spiced cider hung heavy in the air. Edward gave thanks for family, for health, for another year together under one roof. His words were steady, but I could hear the hesitation in them, as if even he felt the weight of holding us together. When the prayer ended, he lifted his glass higher. A toast, he said. To the family we have built, to the joy of children, to the promise of another bright year. The guests raised their glasses, voices overlapping with warm cheers. Margaret slipped her hand around his arm, beaming, her pearls glinting in the light. To anyone else, she looked like the perfect hostess, serene and proud. I raised my own glass and smiled faintly, but my eyes wandered to the walls. That was when the realization hit. Our house had always been decorated with framed photographs, carefully arranged like a gallery of family triumphs. Above the fireplace now hung Daniel and Laura's wedding portrait, oversized and glamorous, with Laura's veil caught in midair and Daniel gazing at her with confidence. Just beyond the dining room table, in a silver frame propped on the sideboard, was a new engagement photo of Sophie and Ryan. They stood beneath a canopy of autumn leaves, Sophie's ring shining as if it had been positioned just for the camera. But my photograph was gone. Last year, there had been a picture of me in front of the Christmas tree, Emily on my lap and Jacob clutching my hand as we laughed at something, Laura said behind the camera. It had not been perfect, but it had been real. I remembered pausing in the hallway when I visited over the summer, glancing at that photo and thinking, maybe, for once, my place in this family had been acknowledged. Now the wall was bare. The space where my frame had hung was nothing but clean paint, as if it had never been there at all. My chest tightened. The laughter around me dulled, and all I could hear was the echo of my mother's voice, guiding conversations, weaving the narrative she wanted everyone to believe. As glasses clinked and guests settled back into their chairs, I leaned closer to her, my voice low so the others would not hear. "Mom," I asked, "what happened to my photo from last year?" Margaret turned just enough to meet my eyes, her smile still wide for the guests. "I thought the house looked better this way. More polished. Cleaner," she said, her tone as casual as if she were commenting on the weather. She adjusted a poinsettia centerpiece and turned to Sophie, asking about bridal fittings, her words spilling seamlessly into the next performance. I sat frozen, fork poised above my plate, her answer replayed in my mind. Sharper, each time. Cleaner. More polished. The ease with which she dismissed me, the way she brushed my existence aside like clutter, sliced deeper than if she had shouted it across the table. I looked again at the wall. The empty space brighter. Somehow, under the chandelier, the deliberate absence screamed louder than any photograph ever could. Around me, the dinner carried on, cheerful voices layering over one another. Rachel passed around a video on her phone of her children singing carols, their small voices squeaky and sweet. Mark launched into a description of paint colors for his new house. Guests leaning in to offer opinions, Daniel fielded questions about the stock market, his voice assured and commanding, while Sophie lifted her left hand so everyone could admire her ring under the candlelight. The conversations overlapped, the air thick with warmth and wine, but I felt the cold edge of exclusion settle into my bones. I pushed a piece of turkey across my plate, my appetite gone. Aunt Helen must have sensed the shift in me. She leaned toward me and whispered, "You okay, honey?" Her eyes were kind, searching my face. I nodded quickly, forcing a smile that did not reach my eyes. She held my gaze a moment longer, then turned back to George's story. Though I knew she had seen too much, my eyes returned to Margaret. She lifted her glass again, the gold bracelet on her wrist catching the light in a quick flash. That gleam, paired with her word polished, made bile rise in my throat. She had erased me from the walls the same way she had stolen my sacrifices, polishing the house until I no longer existed inside it. I tightened my grip on my fork, the metal cold in my hand. The noise of the dinner swirled on, warm and festive to everyone else, but to me, it felt like sitting in a room where the walls themselves had been taught to reject me. I lowered my gaze, steadying myself, and cut into my food. Though I barely tasted it, my smile stayed in place. But inside, her words kept cutting, one after another. Cleaner, more polished. A perfect house. As long as I was nowhere to be seen, Edward rose again, his chair scraping softly against the hardwood as he lifted his glass. The room hushed around him, every fork stilled, every whisper fading. He spoke with a slow dignity, offering thanks for family, for the children who filled the house with laughter, for another Christmas spent together under one roof. His words were steady, practiced, the kind of toast he had likely rehearsed in his head all day. Guests smiled, glasses lifted, the soft glow of candlelight flickering across crystal. Laughter bubbled back up, warm and festive, as people prepared to clink glasses. I lyftet minne too, trying to join in, willing myself to let the cheer wrap around me for just one moment. That was when Margaret's voice cut across the room. Loud, unmistakable, sharp enough to silence the clatter of cutlery. "You don't belong in this family." The words landed with the weight of a hammer against glass. The room froze. My glass hovered midair, the wine trembling inside. All around me faces stiffened, eyes widened, and hands faltered in mid-toast. Daniel's eyes darted away, fixed suddenly on the tablecloth as if studying every stitch. Laura's mouth parted in shock, her hand flying instinctively to Emily's shoulder. Sophie blinked, color draining from her face, her fingers tightening around her napkin until it wrinkled in her lap. The silence was so complete I could hear the faint tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. Aunt Helen's fork slipped from her hand and clattered onto her plate, the sound echoing in the stillness. George looked at Margaret with an expression that blended disbelief and horror. His jaw set, his brow furrowed. A couple of neighbors at the far end shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances that carried the same message. We should not be here for this. I sat frozen, the sting of her words sinking in, colder than any winter wind. My chest tightened, heat rising into my face. But beneath it all, a calm anger stirred, slow and steady. I set my glass down carefully on the table, the stem cool against my fingers. Then I drew a breath, steady enough to surprise myself, and spoke with a clarity that cut through the silence. Perfect. Then stop asking me for money for these Christmas dinners. The words rang through the dining room like a crack of thunder. For a heartbeat. No one moved. Margaret's smile faltered, her composure crumbling at the edges as the weight of my response struck her. The carefully crafted script she had been playing for years was unraveling in front of 30 witnesses. Murmurs broke out. Rachel's eyes widened as she leaned back in her chair. Mark shifted uncomfortably, glancing from me to Margaret as if unsure where to land his gaze. Helen turned in her chair, her face pale with outrage. "Margaret," she whispered, her voice trembling. "How could you say something like that?" George shook his head, his voice low but firm. "Unbelievable. Just unbelievable." Margaret opened her mouth, but for once, no words came out. Her hand trembled slightly as she placed her glass back on the table. The guests were restless now, chairs scraping lightly as a few shifted or leaned away. Unwilling to be caught in the middle of what had just erupted, two neighbors excused themselves quietly, rising with murmured apologies as they slipped toward the hallway. Their departure sent a ripple of tension down the table. Like the first break in a dam, I sat straighter, my palms flat on the table, refusing to shrink the way I always had before. My voice had been calm, but the tremor in my chest was real. Years of swallowed words had just poured out in one unyielding sentence. Daniel cleared his throat, his voice tight. "Maybe we should." But Laura touched his arm sharply, her eyes telling him not to interfere. Sophie sat frozen, her lips pressed together, as if realizing there was no polite way to stitch the moment back together. Margaret finally found her voice, though it shook at the edges. "That is not true," she said quickly, her eyes darting around the table as though daring someone to contradict me. "We have always supported this family together." Helen leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "I have been coming to these dinners for years. Margaret, I know who carries the trays. I know who keeps this house running while you take the credit." Her voice was louder now, trembling with indignation. The room felt smaller, the garlands and candles closing in as the weight of decades pressed down on the table. My mother's mask of perfection was cracking in front of the very people she had spent her life impressing. I picked up my glass again, not to toast, but to steady my hand. The wine trembled slightly as I set it back down. My heart hammered in my chest, but I held my chin high, staring at the woman who had just tried to erase me with a single sentence. The Christmas music played faintly in the background, a soft carol at odds with the charged silence that followed. Guests exchanged uneasy glances, some leaning back, some lowering their eyes. Edward sat stiff, his gaze fixed on the table, saying nothing, as though silence could make the moment vanish. But it was too late. The truth had already been spoken, and there was no way to gather it back. I folded my napkin carefully in my lap, letting the silence settle over me like a heavy blanket. Around me, the warmth of the season flickered dim, replaced by the raw crack of honesty that had been buried for far too long. My hand drifted toward my purse, the leather strap cool under my fingertips. For weeks I had carried that envelope everywhere, the weight of it a constant reminder of truths I had not yet dared to speak. Now, in the stunned quiet of the dining room, when all masks had slipped and nothing was left but raw edges, I knew the time had come. The flap crinkled as I slid the papers free. Heads turned. Chairs shifted. Forks stilled. The sound of paper unfolding was louder than the Christmas carol playing faintly in the background. I spread the documents on the linen tablecloth, their stark black letters a sharp contrast to the red berries embroidered along the fabric. "These are adoption records," I said, my voice steady, though my hands shook. "Cook County. Finalized in 1993. My birth name was not Donovan." A ripple of gasps traveled down the table. Sophie's hand flew to her mouth, her wide eyes shining with tears. Daniel froze, his glass still halfway to his lips. Laura reached for Emily and Jacob, pulling them close, as if she could shield them from the weight of adult truths. Aunt Helen shot to her feet, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. 30 years. Margaret. 30 years. You hid this from everyone. Her voice cracked with fury, echoing across the stunned room. Margaret's face drained of color, then flushed red. She opened her mouth, but for once, nothing came out. Her eyes darted to Edward, pleading silently for him to intervene. Edward's shoulders slumped as he bowed his head. His voice was low, ragged, almost broken. "It was my idea. After Daniel was born, when the doctors said Margaret could not have more children, I suggested adoption. I thought it would be good for the family, for Daniel to have siblings." The admission hung heavy in the air. He rubbed his forehead with shaking hands, unable to look at me. Margaret snapped out of her silence, her voice rising shrill and desperate. "Do not you dare put this on me, Edward. I carried the weight. I raised her for 29 years. I clothed her, fed her, gave her a home. She was never mine. But I did it anyway." Her words were knives, each one slicing deeper than the last. Helen's voice trembled with rage. "Raised her, you diminished her. You stole her moments. I have watched that girl work herself raw at every holiday while you paraded Daniel and Sophie like trophies. Do not you dare rewrite history now." George leaned forward, his knuckles white against the table. "I cannot believe what I am hearing. You speak of her like she is baggage, when she has given more to this family than any of us." Margaret's eyes flashed as she slammed her palm against the table. "I never wanted this. She was forced on me. Every time I looked at her, I remembered what I could not have. And still I made her part of this family." Gasps rang out. Sophie dissolved into tears, her napkin pressed against her face. Daniel looked stricken, his chest rising and falling as though he were struggling to breathe. Laura's voice shook as she whispered, "Margaret, stop. Please stop." But Margaret only grew louder, her face twisted with anger, her hand trembling as she pointed at me. "She has been nothing but a disappointment. Never the daughter I imagined. Always taking, and never enough." I felt the air leave my chest, but I did not look away. My fingers rested firmly on the documents in front of me. The evidence that explained every cold glance, every missing photo, every backhanded remark. Neighbors had already begun to rise. A couple from across the street whispered apologies, gathering coats, their faces flushed with discomfort. Another pair slipped quietly into the hall, avoiding eye contact. The front door opened and shut with a draft of icy air, and soon the crowd around the table thinned. Helen's face was streaked with fury and disbelief. You call her a burden. Margaret, no. She is the one who has held these dinners together. She is the one who has funded your perfect parties. Without her, all of this would have crumbled long ago. George nodded grimly beside her. And we all sat here, blind, while you robbed her of her place in her own family. Edward lifted his head at last, his eyes glassy, his voice shaking. I should have told you years ago. Claire, I thought silence would protect you. I see now it only chained you to lies. The sound of the clock ticking on the mantel grew louder in the thinning room. The tree lights blinked cheerfully, mocking the devastation at the table. I gathered the papers slowly, my hands steadier now than they had been in weeks. My voice was calm, but every word landed with the weight of years. All I ever wanted was the truth. You denied me that, and now you dare to call me less than family. Margaret's lips curled, but no words came. She turned away, her shoulders stiff, her fingers clawing at the stem of her wineglass. Around us, only the closest relatives remained. Helen stood with her arms crossed, George shaking his head beside her. Laura held the children tightly, whispering to them to stay calm. Sophie sobbed quietly. Ryan's arm wrapped around her shoulders. Daniel stared into the distance, lost and broken. The dining room, once filled with carols and cheer, now pulsed with betrayal and the faint sound of departing footsteps. Nearly every guest was gone, leaving behind a family cracked open under the weight of secrets too long buried. I pushed my chair back slowly, the legs scraping against the hardwood in the thick silence. No one tried to stop me. Margaret stared at the wall, her shoulders rigid, refusing to meet my eyes. Edward sat slumped at the head of the table, pale and defeated. Daniel looked away, Sophie's quiet sobs filling the space between the ticking clock and the flicker of the fire. I gathered my purse, slipped the envelope back inside, and walked out of the dining room. The sound of my heels on the floor echoed through the hall. The Christmas lights on the tree blinked as I passed, their cheerful glow mocking the wreckage behind me. I grabbed my coat, opened the front door, and stepped into the cold. The night air hit me sharp and clean, the snow crunching under my boots as I hurried toward my car. My breath rose in white clouds, but inside it felt strangely stead. The house behind me, with its glowing windows and curated perfection, was no longer mine to carry. I drove back to Chicago in silence, the highway nearly empty, the city's skyline rising faintly against the dark horizon. By the time I reached my apartment, my hands were stiff on the wheel. I hung up my coat, set my purse on the counter, and sat on the couch, letting the stillness wrap around me. For the first time in years, the quiet felt like freedom. The calls began the next morning. Edward's number appeared first. I hesitated before answering, but finally pressed accept. His voice was low, trembling. Claire, I am so sorry. I should have spoken up years ago. I should have protected you. I thought silence would keep the peace, but it only hurt you. I listened quietly, hearing the weight in his words. He confessed he had seen Margaret's bitterness, had seen her cut me down in small ways, and had chosen to look away. He begged me to give him a chance to rebuild something with me, not as the shadow of Margaret's husband, but as a father who wanted to make amends. Later that afternoon, Daniel called. His tone was strained, guilt heavy in his voice. I saw how unfair it was. Claire, he admitted, I knew Mom treated you differently, but I convinced myself it was just her way. I let it happen because it was easier for me. He paused, then added, I am sorry I did not stand up for you. That night, Sophie's name lit my phone. She was crying before I could even speak. I am sorry. Claire, I went along with her so many times, laughed at her jokes at your expense, let her pit us against you. I thought siding with her meant safety, but now I see it only made me a coward. Please believe me. You never deserted. Their apologies softened something inside me, but they could not erase years of silence. I thanked them, but I kept my distance. Trust would not come back in a single phone call. Aunt Helen's voice was the one that reached me deepest. She called the following evening, her tone fierce and steady. "You did nothing wrong. Claire." The truth needed to be spoken. She paused, her breath heavy in the receiver. "I have watched her diminish you for years, and I regret not saying more sooner. But know this. You were right to speak up." I closed my eyes, letting her words settle over me like a balm. For the first time since that night, I felt seen without having to fight for it. Margaret never called. Instead, whispers traveled back through neighbors and family friends. She told people I had ruined Christmas, that I had stood up at her table and attacked her out of spite. She painted herself as the victim, clutching at the sympathy of anyone who would listen, but the story did not land the way she expected. The neighbors who had been at the dinner had already seen the truth with their own eyes. One by one, they stopped visiting, stopped inviting her to luncheons and book clubs. Mrs. Henderson, who had known her for years, stopped by my apartment instead. She set a tin of cookies on my counter and said gently, "What your mother did was cruel." Everyone saw it. Word spread quickly. By the end of the week, Margaret was more isolated than ever. The invitations stopped, the phone calls dwindled, and the glow of her carefully maintained social world dimmed. She had tried to cast me as the destroyer, but instead she had exposed herself. I walked through the snow-covered streets of Chicago, the city lights bright against the winter sky, and felt something shift inside me. For years I had carried the burden of her rejection, the constant sense of not being enough. Now, for the first time, that weight was gone. At home, I lit a small candle on my table, poured a cup of tea, and opened the envelope again. The papers no longer felt like a weapon or a curse. They were simply the truth, and the truth was mine to carry. However I chose. The phone buzzed again. It was another cousin reaching out, her message short but powerful. "We are with you. We always were." I set the phone down, a small smile breaking across my face. The house in Naperville might have cast me out, but beyond its walls, people were beginning to see me clearly. The snow kept falling outside my window. The city hushed in white. For the first time, the silence did not feel empty. It felt like a beginning. By the time summer rolled around, Chicago had traded its snow for sunlight that poured through every window of my apartment. On the last Saturday in July, I stood in my kitchen arranging platters of food and realized it was the first time I had ever looked forward to celebrating my own birthday. Turning 30 felt like a milestone. But more than that, it felt like a marker of a new chapter. The apartment buzzed with voices. Not too many. Just enough to fill the rooms with warmth instead of pressure. Daniel arrived first with Laura and the kids. Their arms full of balloons and a cake box. Emily darted in ahead of them, her laughter echoing down the hallway as Jacob tried to keep up. Sophie and Ryan showed up soon after, carrying flowers and a bottle of wine. Aunt Helen and Uncle George followed, their arms open for a hug the moment they stepped inside. Jessica, my closest friend since college, breezed in with a bag of gifts and immediately made herself at home in the kitchen, arranging drinks like she had lived there her whole life. My cousins filled the living room with chatter, their easy laughter spilling out through the balcony doors where we had strung up lights for the evening. But the person who made me catch my breath was Carolyn, my birth mother. She stepped through the doorway with careful grace, her auburn hair swept back, her eyes shining with both nerves and love. She had driven from Milwaukee just to be here, holding a small box in her hands like it contained something fragile. When our eyes met, she whispered, "Happy birthday, sweetheart," and I felt something inside me ease. The room was cozy, full of mismatched chairs and plates balanced on laps. Nothing like the curated luxury Margaret had always demanded. The food was simple, some ordered in, some homemade, but every bite tasted like care instead of duty. Edward had called 2 weeks earlier, his voice tentative, asking if he could come. He hesitated, but in the end I told him, yes. He arrived that evening carrying a leather-bound album, worn at the edges, and when he opened it on my coffee table, my breath caught. Inside were pictures of me from every year of my life, photos I had never seen displayed in the house in Naperville, school portrait, art show ribbons, snapshots of me at the park. He had kept them all, quietly, for nearly 3 decades. I sat next to him turning pages, the weight of old pain mixing with something gentler. He looked at me with watery eyes and said, "I could not give you what you deserved back then, but I want you to know, I never stopped seeing you." We gathered later on the balcony as the sun dipped low, casting everything in gold. Glasses were raised, laughter rose, and for the first time the words, "Happy birthday," felt like they belonged to me. Daniel leaned over and whispered that he was proud of me. Sophie squeezed my hand, her eyes full of apology and hope. Helen kissed the top of my head and said, "This is the family you were always meant to have." I looked around at the circle of faces, some bound to me by blood, others by choice, and I finally felt the truth settle deep in my chest. Family is not the people who demand perfection or strip you down to fit their image. Family is the people who see you, who stay, who love you as you are. When everyone gathered for the toast, Edward raised his glass, his voice thick but steady. To Claire, to 30 years of resilience, and to the years ahead where she will finally know she belongs. The clink of glasses rang out, and in that moment, I knew I was no longer the outsider. I was exactly where I was meant to be. If you have ever faced moments where family made you feel small or unwanted, I would love to hear how you found your way through. Share your story in the comments, because your voice matters. If this journey spoke to you, please like this video and subscribe for more stories about truth, resilience, and finding the families that truly accept us. Thank you for being here. And here is to creating spaces where we all finally belong.